to, I have spent a lot of time over the last 2.5 years thinking about risk. I'm going to talk a lot about a particular project that I was a part of as part of the Rebuild by Design competition. But shortly after Sandy, I found myself working with the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency for the city of New York and related to developing coastal protection strategies. Also with the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program, in addition to the housing program, New York State actually worked with individual communities, I think up to 100 now across New York State, including 10 in New York City, worked with 7 of those through the Rebuild by Design competition that this project came out of, and most recently through the National Disaster Resilience Competition, which is the sort of, I would say, the next iteration of Rebuild by Design that HUD has taken it national, and working with the Rockefeller Foundation to provide technical assistance. So this idea of risk and resilience has been sort of at the heart of what I've been doing over the last couple of years. And I wanted to sort of, I was thinking, like, what can I add to this conversation? I really want to talk about sort of some takeaways and themes that have come out of this. I want to think a little bit about risk, which I think has been really introduced well so far, is that it's uncertain. Risk is really about we don't know what's going to happen. And we can predict and anticipate, but there's a lot of unknowns. And that's kind of what this graphic is talking about. In the particular case of New York and coastal flooding, because I'm going to talk about that, I want to highlight a little on the graphic on the left, that risk is also related to where you are. It's not just about the big threat of climate change and sea level rise. That everywhere you are is a little bit different. When we talk about the 100-year storm, it's not that it's going to happen every 100 years, right? There's 1 in 100 chance it's going to happen this year. The 10,000-year storm it might happen once. There's a 1 in 10,000 chance it's going to happen. What we find in the case in New York is the difference, the physical difference between that storm event that we think is going to happen once every 100 years and the one we're going to think is going to happen every 10,000 years is about 9 feet. Whereas in a place like the Netherlands, the difference between those water elevations is about 3 feet. So you see right now, as a design professional, we're confronted with a very different problem. And risk means something very different, or at least coastal flood risk. And so, in addition to that sort of magnitude difference, you can't eliminate risk. It never goes away. If you build a flood wall, you haven't eliminated risk. You just lower the chance of being flooded at any given time. When we start planning for resilience, quality of life has everything to do with resilience. The fact that you have a job and are making money and can afford to rebuild your home has everything to do with how well and effectively you recover. Similarly, if your infrastructure is functioning in your city. And so these things are interconnected. It's not high. And there are no generic solutions. This difference in condition that I just talked about, we're talking a lot about strategies that apply to everywhere, and the project that I'll speak to is really about trying to create replicable solutions, but replicable solutions aren't generic solutions. They're strategies, and you really have to understand how and why a particular strategy works in a particular location, and why it applies. And so one of the principles that we've worked kind of moving forward is this idea of designing to perceive risk and reduce fragility, reduce the sort of susceptibility to failure, and help everyone understand what risk really means and what resilience does. So the project that I'm going to talk a lot about today is Living Breakwaters. It was developed as part of the HUD Rebuild by Design competition, which I'm not going to talk about because I'm going to steal Tara's thunder if I do. So this project was led by SCAPE, Landscape Architecture. I am a landscape architect, but I actually work for Parsons Brinkerhoff, which is an engineering firm. That sounds strange. But this effort was actually a collaboration of SCAPE, of Parsons Brinkerhoff, with Ocean and Coastal Consultants, who are a marine engineering firm, the Stevens Institute of Technology with Dr. Phil Orton. So it was a really sort of robust team of people thinking about this. And so thinking about the work on this project, but also all of these different initiatives that I mentioned, I think there's a couple themes that emerge from these projects that I want to highlight to everyone as we think about how we address these issues that people have talked about. One is the idea of creating layered solutions, multifunctional solutions, solutions that are informed and solutions that are collaborative. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by each of these strategies. So when we think about layered strategies, this idea that you can't eliminate risk. You always leave some amount of risk on the table. And when we talk about the risk of coastal flood risk for New York City, we focus a lot actually on those bottom two blocks, right? On climate change, sea level rise, and flooding. Well, in a storm, you also actually have damage by waves. You actually have erosion. And on top of those factors, you actually have a lot of vulnerabilities, like what Brian talked about, that your buildings just aren't resilient to that, or that people don't have the capacity to recover, or your power systems aren't protected. And so there are some things we really can't do a whole lot about, like stopping sea level rise. As the world we can, but as a single city we can't. But there are lots of other things that contribute to risk. And so when we think about strategies, there's opportunities to layer on pieces that reduce that. And so this project, the idea of living breakwaters, which I'll tell you about the strategy a little later, is it's one piece of a layered solution. So a breakwater offshore is designed to reduce wave action, but that doesn't mean it's going to eliminate risk. You also want to elevate buildings, repair buildings, make them more resilient, give people early warning systems, and really start to build a robust physical layers of resiliency, but also a sort of a culture of resiliency. Knowledge, responsiveness, ability to actually adapt and respond and change to these disasters. And then you want to make things that are multifunctional. This is a rendering of this idea of living breakwaters. A breakwater is a big, usually rock structure offshores that knock down waves to keep them from hitting and damaging things on the shore. But they can also be a lot of other things. What you find is you start to see fish and nest and live in these places. Oysters form on them to create reefs. And so we really try to re-envision the idea of a breakwater as something that could also be a piece of habitat and add to the whole coastal environment of Staten Island where this project takes place. And so I think this applies really to all infrastructure, flood infrastructure, roads, that the age of single purpose infrastructure is really over. You can't build something for one purpose. It's got to do lots of things. We don't have enough space in our cities. We don't have enough money in our budgets to do one thing. So how can it do lots of things at once? And so this is just to illustrate sort of how we built up this sort of ecological component, looking at what type of fish and habitats live there. And actually, historically, the South Shore of Staten Island was actually ringed by oyster reefs, which were decimated through harvesting, water pollution, over the last century. And so these oyster reefs actually protected the shore from erosion and wave action, and also are part of the economy there. They disappeared over time due to these stresses. And so while this project isn't a direct restoration project, it's restoring some of that ecological function that once was a part of Staten Island's ecology and also industry. And this idea of coupling, I just want to highlight some of these other resources. This idea of coupling environment and ecological solutions with solutions that actually reduce coastal risk is a very it's a growing area of research, and there's a lot of resources on this, and particularly focused on the New York region. The part of the most recent North Atlantic Comprehensive Coastal Study by the Army Corps of Engineers has thought about this. The Nature Conservancy is working on it. The New York City has partnered with New York State and the New England Panel Nui pick to look at, to set a research agenda for New York Harbor. So there's a lot of thinking and research on this, but it's not just about fish. The idea that it needs to also be about people. So these breakwaters that we talked about, stopping waves, calming water, also create calm water. You can kayak in it. You build beaches that people can go to and really begin to reconnect neighborhoods to the ocean. So rather than building a wall, actually creating space and the environment for people to inhabit the shoreline. So you really, the next thing I'm talking about is being informed. It's actually, you know, when we were tasked with the Rebuild by Design competition, one of the requirements was to use the best available science. And you want to be visionary and think visionary as a designer. You also want to be grounded in reality and what works. And so we spent a lot of time actually working with ecologists and actually even local fishermen and clamorers to really understand the habitat of the area and adapt these to avoid existing habitat and actually begin to design the scale and size of the breakwaters at a macro scale, but at a micro scale for the fish and the type of juvenile fish that live there. So this is actually really informed by how these species live. And then you're like, you've been talking a lot about this habitat and all of this, but what about risk? The other thing was really modeling these breakwaters to understand how they impacted wave action. And so this is actually a map of some hydrodynamic analysis that Phil Orton at the Stevens Institute did. This is what happens on Staten Island in a Sandy-like storm with 3 feet of sea level rise if there are no breakwaters there. You see waves, 6-foot waves, 4-foot waves. If anyone's familiar with a FEMA flood map, there's that big red zone on the map, which is like the area you stay out of. It's really dim. That means the waves are over 3 feet. So basically you're looking at critical damage, you're looking at these destroyed houses knocked feet off their foundation at 3 feet. And so the South Shore of Staten Island is really very exposed. And what we see is once you start putting these breakwaters in, you start seeing huge reductions in wave height. And so through this, we were actually able to model the impact of the breakwaters, looking at where erosion would happen with or without them, and the reduction in wave to really understand what is the damage impact. And this was important because breakwaters aren't a wall. They're not keeping out flood risk. And this was sort of really critical to this. It's one piece of that layered solution, stepping down risk. And so what they do is they eliminate these wave zones. And I apologize, I should have put a section in here to make it a little bit more clear. But if looking at these flood maps, the sort of zone of 3 feet waves or 1.5-foot waves, where you really see a boat through your front window, your house knocked off your foundation, is very different than like 3 feet of water in your living room, right? So that's the difference that you're looking at. Also starting to reverse coastal erosion, so the loss of the shoreline. Staten Island has lost about 40 acres of shoreline on the South Shore over the last 100 years. So you can imagine if your houses, there are people whose houses were 50 feet from the beach when they moved there, and now it's 2 feet. So you can imagine in a storm that has a big impact. And this is something that really resonated with residents of Staten Island, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Because the last point I want to make is about collaboration, and communication really is part of that. I talked a little bit about our team, our professional team that worked on this project, but it was really a much bigger team of people. We spent a lot of time talking to nonprofit organizations and academic institutions and scientists. We spent a lot of time talking to community leaders and politicians, regulatory advisors to really understand the regulatory environment in which these would need to be constructed, and then community groups and stakeholders there on the ground. Working with other ongoing initiatives to make sure that this project wasn't over here while something else was happening, but that actually it worked in concert to start to build up some of those layered solutions that we talked about. So people are adapting their homes on the South Shore. The New York Rising Committee has proposed a dune system that these breakwaters would then protect. And so creating those layers actually it was part of working together. And then there was a lot of outreach. There was traditional outreach, like community meetings you see on the upper left, but it was about events where we worked with kids to sort of familiarize them with the shoreline and the risks. Working with the New York Harbor School, who's a member of our team I didn't mention, that works with student organizations, with schools throughout the city to teach kids about ecological, the marine environment. They do oyster habitat restoration. And then the picture on the upper right, I actually just want to point out, because we also worked with residents and industries on Staten Island. So this is a picture of Gina Worth from SCAPE actually sitting down and making a map of clam habitat with clammers who work in Staten Island. So it's like the Department of Environmental Conservation said, well, you can't build these where there's clam habitat, but we don't have a map for that. So we said, who knows? I was like, we should just talk to the clammers. And so collaboration doesn't always just mean traditional community meetings. It's really getting out on the ground and talking to people and understanding the environment. And so going back to that idea of reducing risk and stepping down risk, this is actually a slide from our community meetings. People were like, this is never going to go over well with people because you're not building a wall, you're not stopping the water. But through having this conversation with folks, and understanding the sort of perceived risks that a lot of people on Staten Island had, people didn't really seem to have a problem with this. They understood that that a lot of the problem is the erosion of the shoreline, is the sort of extreme damage to their homes, and that actually ratcheting down this risk was a big part of the solution. And I think that's one of the things that really resonated that I really encourage everybody to think is to broaden your idea and really make sure you're thinking about how you address different components of the risk. And the other part is just that collaboration does is it builds momentum and enthusiasm. And so we really talked a lot with people on the project. The politicians here, sort of looking at it, community school kids, and the story with the woman in the oyster hat. My boss was actually he lives on Staten Island, he's getting off the ferry, and he texted, oh my gosh, you guys, that's a really, that's a great way to promote the last public meeting you're having. And they're like, and people ask, what are you talking about? We didn't make this oyster hat. So this woman took it upon herself to design a oyster hat and hand out pamphlets at the Staten Island ferry to get people to come to the community meeting. So you've got to make, if you're going to try to do something big and build resilience, you've got to make it bigger than yourself. So I think that those are the lessons learned. The specific project, Living Breakwaters, Tara will give you a little bit more on the background of Rebuild by Design. It was a competition that was run. The state of New York was awarded money to implement this project, and they're now moving forward with it. And I hope you all will follow it.